A decorated federal agent, badge on his belt, gun at his hip, credentials in hand, dragged along the asphalt by 4 officers who refused to listen. Not a suspect, not a criminal, a man who had spent 11 years hunting them. 6 hours later, the most powerful law enforcement agency on American soil stormed the doors of the Harrow County Sheriff's Office, and when they left, nothing would ever be the same. 17 careers ended. A city broke. And the officer who started it all, he never saw it coming. This is the story of Special Agent Darius Cole, and it's as brutal as it sounds. The night of March 14th felt ordinary in Harrow County, Georgia, the kind of Tuesday that slips off the calendar without a trace. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen, and the streets around the Westbrook Warehouse District were mostly quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of a cargo truck grinding its gears on Route 9. Special Agent Darius Cole had been awake for 22 hours. He sat in a rented Chevrolet Silverado pickup, deliberately chosen to resemble the kind of truck a drug buyer might drive, parked at the edge of a gravel lot behind a disused auto parts warehouse. His phone rested on his thigh, its screen dimmed to the lowest setting. On the seat next to him lay a worn leather jacket, a half-eaten granola bar, and a federal surveillance file stamped with the bold red seal, Operation Ironclad. Darius was 38 years old, a graduate of Howard University and the FBI Academy at Quantico, a man who had spent more than a decade infiltrating some of the most dangerous criminal networks operating in the southern United States. He had dismantled the Castellano drug pipeline running out of Miami. He had infiltrated a white-collar gun trafficking ring in Birmingham. He had testified before a federal grand jury 4 times and had never lost a case. That night, he was 3 days away from closing the biggest operation of his career. The Westbrook Cartel, a loosely affiliated mid-level drug distribution network operating in 6 Georgia counties, had been under FBI surveillance for 14 months. Darius had spent the last 3 of those months undercover, gaining the trust of a man named Troy Biggs, a former Army logistics officer who now ran distribution through 4 small, seemingly legitimate businesses. The purchase that would turn Troy over was scheduled for Thursday, 2 days later. Darius just needed to watch one last delivery that night to confirm the location of a secondary warehouse where the FBI believed most of the cartel's product was being stored. He was alone in the car because that was protocol. No visible backup, no markings, nothing to scare the subjects. At 11:47 p.m., a Harrow County patrol car rolled slowly into the parking lot. Darius noticed it but didn't react. He was used to patrol officers driving around areas like this. He kept his eyes on the warehouse loading dock, one hand resting casually on his knee. The patrol car stopped, then reversed. Then its headlights flickered on, flooding the Silverado's cab with a blinding white light. Darius exhaled slowly through his nose. He understood what this looked like. A black man alone in a truck in an industrial district past midnight. He'd dealt with these kinds of stops before. He knew the procedure. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible and still, and waited. Officer Brad Kowalski stepped out of the patrol car. He was 29 years old, 4 years on the force, with a square jaw and the confident stride of a man who had never doubted whether he might be wrong about anything. Behind him, his partner, Officer Ryan Tess, got out of the passenger side and moved to position himself behind the truck. Kowalski approached the driver's window, his hand resting on his holster. "Sir, roll down your window, exit the vehicle." Darius rolled down his window. He didn't get out. Instead, very slowly and deliberately, he spoke first. "Officer, I need to inform you that I am a federal law enforcement agent. I'm going to reach into my jacket and show you my credentials. Please don't be alarmed." There was a pause. Kowalski's eyes narrowed. "I said, "Get out of the vehicle, officer. Now get out now." Darius kept his voice measured. "I'm Special Agent Darius Cole with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm on an active surveillance operation in this area. I need you to call your supervisor before this situation escalates." Kowalski glanced at Tess. Something passed between them. Not caution, not uncertainty, but something closer to irritation. The irritation of a man who doesn't like being corrected by the person he's already decided is subordinate to. "Get out of the vehicle," Kowalski said again, this time louder. "Last warning." Darius slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "I'm reaching for my credentials. Hands now." Kowalski drew his weapon. Everything that happened next took less than 40 seconds. Darius Cole was led out of the Silverado with his hands up, his badge and FBI credentials in plain sight, still calmly speaking to two officers who had already made their decision. "I'm a federal agent. My badge number is Shut Up. Hands behind your back. My supervising agent is Lisa Trenton. Her number is on my phone. Please call her. Non-compliance, we will add resisting arrest to the charge." "What charge? What am I being accused of?" No one answered that question. Not then. Not for the next hour. Officer Tess found the surveillance file on the seat. She held it up, the red Operation Ironclad seal clearly visible, and showed it to Kowalski. A reasonable person at that moment would have stopped, taken a breath, and said, "Wait, let's think about this." Kowalski was not a reasonable person that night. "It could be anything," he said. "Arrest him." Darius was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol car. His phone, his direct link to the FBI field office in Atlanta, was put in an evidence bag. His badge, his credentials, his gun, his surveillance file, all bagged, labeled, and locked in the trunk of a patrol vehicle. The charge that eventually appeared on the intake form at the Harrow County PD read, "Suspicious activity, non-compliance, trespassing, not on private property." The parking lot was public. Sergeant Pete Denore was the shift supervisor that night, a man 2 years from retirement who had spent the last decade in the comfortable fog of administrative routine. When Kowalski radioed in the arrest, Denore asked 2 questions. "Is he armed?" "Yes." "Is he under arrest?" "Yes." Then he approved the arrest without asking a single follow-up question. Not about the badge. Not about the credentials. Not about the federal documents in the evidence bag. At 12:19 a.m., Special Agent Darius Cole was processed at the Harrow County Detention Center. At 12:21 a.m., he was placed in a holding cell. At 12:22 a.m., Officer Ryan Tess returned to the Silverado, found a secondary phone Darius used for undercover work, and turned off the FBI tracking device attached to the vehicle's chassis, though he would later claim he had simply moved the vehicle and didn't know what the device was. At 12:23 a.m., the clock started. The holding cell smelled of industrial cleaner and old fear. There were 4 other men inside. 2 appeared to be intoxicated, one was clearly in medical distress and receiving no attention, and one sat perfectly still in a corner, saying nothing. Darius sat on the metal bench, back straight, his mind running through everything he knew. He was entitled to a phone call. He knew that. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the duty officer processing him had logged his phone call request, looked at the name on the log, glanced at the clock, and decided he could wait until the shift supervisor gave the go-ahead. That supervisor was Sergeant Denore, who was currently eating a sandwich in his office and watching a college basketball replay. Darius asked to speak to someone 3 times during the first hour. Anyone in authority, the officer who appeared at the cell door, each time gave the same answer. "Someone will be with you shortly." No one came. Meanwhile, 28 kilometers away, in the Westbrook Warehouse District, The delivery Darius had spent 3 months positioning himself to witness was taking place without him. Troy Biggs received the shipment, signed for it with the casual confidence that comes from knowing the coast is clear, and left. The location of the secondary warehouse, the one piece of the puzzle the FBI needed, remained unknown. Operation Ironclad was compromised. Inside the cell, Darius didn't panic. He was trained not to panic, but as the hours ticked by, 1, then 2, then 3, a cold, methodical anger began to replace his professional composure. At 2:15, he made a decision. The next time an officer approached the cell door, he wouldn't ask politely. He would state clearly and officially who he was and what the consequences of this detention would be. He would be specific. He would be precise. He would give them one last chance to correct a mistake that was still technically correctable. Officer Karen Bledsoe appeared at the cell at 2:40, a junior officer, 3 months out of the academy, conducting a routine welfare check. She peered through the bars at the man on the bench, a man who looked nothing like the other occupants of the cell. A man sat with the composed calm of someone trained to wait. "Do you need something?" she asked. "Yes," Darius said. "I need you to call the FBI field office in Atlanta. The number is 404-679-00. Say that Special Agent Darius Cole has been detained at this facility and request that they contact Assistant Director Frank Okafor immediately. Can you do that?" Bledsoe blinked. "I'll relay the message." "I need you to make the call yourself right now from this hallway. I'll wait." Something in his voice, its absolute certainty, the absence of desperation or boasting, made her hesitate. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked back down the hall, found Sergeant Denore, and repeated what the man in cell 4 had told her. Denore chewed his sandwich. "If he were with the FBI, they would have called looking for him by now. He says they took his phone as evidence, so he'll get his call in the morning." Bledsoe went back to her rounds, but she didn't forget the conversation, and later, much later, she would be the only person in the Harriff County PD who wouldn't face termination, because unlike everyone else in that building that night, she had at least tried. At 3:30 a.m., Captain Rick Harlan arrived at the station for an early shift. Harlan was 52 years old, a 20-year veteran, the kind of man who used phrases like "by the book" and "chain of command" as shields against having to think independently. When Denore briefed him on the arrest, including the fact that the suspect claimed to be a federal agent, Harlan's response was telling. "Did he say anything else? He keeps asking for a phone call. What are the charges? Suspicious activity? Non-compliance? Trespassing?" Harlan nodded. "Keep him until morning. We'll sort it out in daylight. We'll sort it out in daylight." 6 words that would ultimately cost Rick Harlan his pension, his reputation, and nearly his freedom. At 4:55, Darius Cole had been detained for 4 hours and 36 minutes. At 5:10, something changed. Back at the FBI field office in Atlanta, Special Agent Lisa Trenton, Darius's supervising agent and the person designated as his emergency contact in the Bureau's internal system, had arrived early for a briefing on Operation Ironclad. She was expecting a report from Darius, who was due to call at 1 a.m. with surveillance notes. No call had come in. She tried his voicemail. She tried his covert phone. Nothing. She pinged the Silverado's tracking device. No signal returned. Lisa Trenton had worked alongside Darius Cole for 6 years. She knew his habits, his protocols, his discipline. The man never skipped reports. Never. She called Assistant Director Frank Okafor at home. Frank Okafor was 55 years old, a second-generation Nigerian-American who had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, attended Yale Law, spent 30 years climbing the FBI ladder, and now served as Assistant Director of the Atlanta Field Office, which oversaw federal operations in 4 southeastern states. He was also a man known among those who knew him well for one particular quality. Once he decided something needed to be done, nothing in the world moved faster than its execution. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me," he said. Lisa told him. At 5:45 a.m., 3 FBI vehicles headed to Harrow County. They didn't use sirens. That was the detail people would remember later. Those who were there, those who saw it, happen. 3 black SUVs rolling through the pre-dawn streets of Harrow County, Georgia, without a sound, just lights and purpose. Assistant Director Frank Okafor walked through the front door of the Harrow County Sheriff's Office at 6:03 a.m. Behind him were 8 federal agents, 3 of whom were carrying what would later be described in department records as a significant volume of legal documentation. The officer on duty, a man named Gary Prout, who had been working the night shift for 11 years and had never seen anything remotely like this, stood up from his chair and opened his mouth. "Don't stop," he said. "Where is Special Agent Darius Cole?" It wasn't a question. It had the grammar of a question, but the weight of an ultimatum. Gary Prout, to his credit, responded immediately. "Cell Block B, sir. Sir, who am I? Can I see anything?" Okafor raised his credentials without slowing down. The FBI found Captain Rick Harlan in his office, a cup of coffee in his hand, reviewing a patrol schedule. When the door opened and he saw Okafor, 6 feet tall, immaculate in a charcoal suit, radiating the specific kind of controlled fury that comes from a man who has learned to use his composure as a weapon, Harlan put down his coffee slowly, very slowly. "Captain Harlan, Okafor says you currently have a federal law enforcement officer in one of your cells. You've been holding him for approximately 6 hours. He's on an active undercover operation that your officers have now compromised. I'm going to need you to release him immediately, and then I'm going to need you to sit in that chair and not make any phone calls. Do you understand?" Harlan's mouth moved. No sound came out. "Captain," he said. "Yes, I understand." Darius Cole was released from cell 4 at 6:09. He walked out of the cell block into the corridor and stopped when he saw Okafor. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. Darius still in the clothes he'd worn during guard duty, his jaw clenched, his eyes with the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. "Are you okay?" Okafor asked. "No," Darius said. "Not one bit." Okafor nodded. "Good. I need you to be honest today." He placed a hand briefly on Darius's shoulder. "Your operation, is it salvageable?" Darius thought of Troy Biggs leaving at midnight, of the delivery that had gone missing, of 14 months of work. "Not in its current form," he said. The word Okafor used in response isn't one that appears in the official record, but everyone in the hallway heard it. At 7 in the morning, Hargrove County Sheriff Wayne Stetler had been woken by a call from Captain Harr. The story Harlan told him was already beginning to compress and reshape itself, as stories do when the people telling them are afraid. Harlan's version: 2 officers had responded to a suspicious vehicle call. The occupant hadn't cooperated. The arrest had followed standard protocol. No one knew he was with the FBI. An honest mistake. Chief Stetler, a burly man in his 60s who had led the Harrow County Police Department for 9 years, largely avoiding controversy, arrived at the station at 7:30 to find it already swarming with federal agents. He was greeted in the parking lot by Special Agent Lisa Trenton, who handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a minute-by-minute timeline reconstructed from cell tower data, internal logs from the recording systems, surveillance footage from inside the facility, and radio dispatch logs. Stetler read it. His face slowly turned from pink to gray. "The body cameras," he said. "From the officers who made the arrests." "We've already requested them," Trenton said politely. "Both cameras were off during the arrest." There was a pause. Both, Stetler repeated. Both simultaneously at 11:52 p.m., which is coincidentally exactly 8 minutes after Officer Kowalski spotted the vehicle in the parking lot and radioed his partner. This was no coincidence. According to Harrow County PD policy, a policy written, signed, and distributed by Wayne Stetler himself, body cameras were required to be activated during any field contact with a civilian. The deactivation of 2 cameras at the same time, minutes before an arrest, was not a malfunction of equipment. It was a decision. What no one at the Harrow County PD had considered, what Brad Kowalski and Ryan Tess specifically hadn't considered, was the parking lot across the street from the warehouse. It belonged to a cold storage logistics company called Southern Cross Refrigeration. Southern Cross had upgraded its exterior security system 8 months earlier, installing 4 high-definition cameras with a field of view that extended well beyond its own property line. The cameras were motion-activated and stored 30 days of footage on a private server. FBI forensic technicians extracted the footage at 8:15 a.m. What they found was exhaustive, unequivocal, and devastating. The footage showed Darius Cole's hands raised the entire time. It showed him speaking calmly and clearly to both officers. It showed him slowly reaching into his jacket pocket with an explicit verbal warning. It showed Officer Kowalski looking directly at the FBI credentials in Darius's hand, not glancing, not peering, looking for approximately 4 full seconds. And then it showed Kowalski turning to Tess with a particular expression, an expression that would be described by 2 separate behavioral analysts in later proceedings as contempt, before saying something that the camera audio partially captured with the enhanced microphones preserved as 2 words. Never mind. Never mind. Those 2 words became the center of gravity around which everything else collapsed. At 9 a.m., FBI forensic accountant Dana Crowell, brought in by Okafor's team, began reviewing the Harrow County PD's personnel records. What she found over the next 48 hours would broaden the scope of the investigation far beyond a botched arrest on a Tuesday night. Brad Kowalski had 3 prior complaints filed against him. All 3 had been reviewed by Sergeant Pete Denore. All 3 had been dismissed with the note, "The officer exercised appropriate judgment given the field conditions." Ryan Tess had 2 complaints. Same reviewer, same notation. In the past 3 years, 14 Harrow County PD officers had accumulated complaints that had been reviewed and dismissed by one of 3 supervisors: Denore, a lieutenant named Carl Weiss, and Captain Rick Harlan himself. The complaints, when Crowell presented them chronologically and demographically, formed a pattern that required no statistical expertise to interpret. Of the 31 complaints filed over a 3-year period involving the use of excessive force or unlawful detention, 28 involved Black or Latino residents. Of those 28, 0 had resulted in disciplinary action. 0. Darius Cole's arrest was not an aberration. It was the system functioning exactly as it had been allowed to function. At 10:30 a.m., Harrow County Mayor Gordon Finch arrived at the police station. He was accompanied by the city's chief attorney, Reginald Ashworth, a meticulous man in his 50s who had handled city legal affairs for 12 years and had a knack for reading courtrooms. Ashworth glanced at the number of federal agents, the volume of files being copied, and the expression on Deputy Chief Okafor's face, and leaned toward Mayor Finch. "Gordon," he said quietly, "we'll need to discuss the compensation figures." Finch, who had spent the previous week campaigning for a road repaving bond, looked at him blankly. "What kind of numbers?" Ashworth didn't answer right away. He was doing mental calculations, the kind involving jury verdicts and federal civil rights statutes, and the current rate for high-profile, unlawful detention cases with documented racial bias, compromised covert operations, and Southern refrigerated footage. Big. Ashworth finally said. The FBI's formal referral to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division came 12 days after the arrest. The referral was 47 pages long, meticulously annotated, and attached as appendices were the Southern refrigeration recordings, the reconstructed timeline, the analysis of Dana Crow's complaint pattern, the It Doesn't Matter audio capture, and a 22-page affidavit from Special Agent Darius Cole that, according to a federal judge who would later review it, read with the precision of a prosecution brief, because Dar Aris had written every word himself, working through 3 nights, channeling 6 hours in that cell into 22 pages of a documented, sequenced, unlegally structured account. The DOJ investigation ran parallel to an internal affairs review by the Georgia Peace Officers Standards and Training Council, GPSTC, which had been contacted by Okafor's office the morning of the arrest. The GPSTC investigator assigned to the case was Sandra Polk, a former Fulton County detective who had spent the last 8 years investigating officer misconduct and had a reputation for thoroughness that her colleagues variously described as admirable or terrifying, depending on which side of her desk they sat on. Sandra Polk spent 17 days in Harriff County. She interviewed 43 people. She retrieved every document the department had generated in the last 4 years. She attended 3 city council meetings and sat in the back of the room taking notes with the quiet focus of someone who already knows what she's looking for and is simply building a path toward it. On the 9th day of her investigation, she found something that had nothing to do with Darius Cole. Buried in a batch of evidence room records from 2022, Sandra found a discrepancy. 8 cases in which items listed as seized evidence had no corresponding disposition records. The evidence had been recorded. It had never been removed, but in 7 of those cases, the criminal charges had been quietly dropped. She pulled out the arresting officer's reports for all 8 cases. 6 of them were signed by Brad Kowalski. When Sandra Polk took this to Captain Harlan, he told her it was an administrative error. When she took it to Chief Stetler, he told her it was an ongoing internal matter. When she took it to Deputy Director Okafor, he picked up his phone and called the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, a woman named Patricia Walden, who cleared her afternoon schedule and asked Okafor to have Sandra Polk in his office at 4 p.m. Brad Kowalski, it turned out, had been removing evidence from seized drugs. Small amounts, enough to sell, not enough to be obvious. He had been doing it for at least 2 years. Sergeant Pete Denore, as the evidence would eventually suggest, had known this since the spring of 2023, and he had used that knowledge to ensure that Kowalski's complaints were always dismissed. For a Kowalski who feared Denore was a Kowalski who kept quiet about Denore's own side income, a protection racket with 2 local businesses that allowed them to avoid enforcing noise ordinances in exchange for monthly cash payments. The thread, once pulled, unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. Lieutenant Carl Weiss had falsified overtime records, $34,000 in 18 months. Captain Rick Harlan had approved a no-bid contract for police vehicle maintenance to a company owned by his brother-in-law. 3 other officers had used department databases to conduct unauthorized searches on private citizens. In 2 cases, the searches focused on individuals involved in personal disputes with officers. Darius Cole's arrest wasn't the beginning of the rot. It was the moment someone shone a light on a rot that had been silently festering for years. Termination proceedings began on April 2nd, 19 days after Darius Cole was released from Cell 4. Officer Brad Kowalski was dismissed, criminally charged with tampering with evidence, civil rights violations under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, and theft of government property. Bail was set at $85,000. Officer Ryan Tess was dismissed, criminally charged with civil rights violations and obstruction of justice for disabling the beacon. Bail was set at $50,000. Sergeant Pete Denore was dismissed, criminally charged with conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and corruption. Bail was set at $120,000. Lieutenant Carl Weiss was dismissed, criminally charged with fraud and falsifying records. Captain Rick Harlan was dismissed under investigation for corruption and contract fraud. Criminal charges pending. Chief Wayne Stetler forced to resign. No criminal charges, but no pension either, after the city determined that his failure to investigate previous complaints constituted a breach of his employment contract. Officer Karen Bledsoe, who had tried, was not only exonerated but promoted. 11 additional officers received disciplinary actions ranging from suspensions to demotions based on findings related to the pattern of complaint suppression and misuse of the database. 17 badges in total disappeared. And it wasn't over yet. Attorney Reginald Ashworth had seen the settlement figure coming the moment he walked into that precinct on the morning of March 15th. What he hadn't fully considered was the multiplier effect. The way a single case, when properly opened, doesn't remain a single case. Darius Cole hired a private attorney within 48 hours of his release, a woman named Charlotte Webb, an Atlanta-based civil rights litigator who had won 4 landmark wrongful arrest cases in the previous decade and was known in Georgia legal circles for her willingness to take every case to trial rather than accept a quiet settlement, because she understood, as she once told an interviewer, that quiet settlements are what cities use to buy silence. Charlotte Webb filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Hargrove County on behalf of Darius Cole on April 15th. The lawsuit named the county, the city, Chief Stetler, Captain Harlan, Officer Kowalski, and Officer Tess as defendants. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and federal civil rights statutes, including a specific claim under Title 42, United States Code, Section 1983, and an adjacent Bivens theory that applied to the systemic nature of the misconduct. The relief prayer sought $12 million. The city, on the advice of every lawyer in its orbit, immediately signaled its willingness to negotiate. What followed were 6 weeks of negotiations that Reginald Ashworth later described, in a moment of unusual candor at a Georgia Bar Association dinner, as the most humiliating experience of my professional life. Each time the city brought a figure to the table, Charlotte Webb politely thanked them and laid another piece of evidence on the table: the footage from the South, the analysis of the complaint pattern, the evidence room discrepancies, the "it doesn't matter" audio clip. And then 3 weeks into the negotiations, in a development no one had anticipated, 12 more people showed up. Not FBI agents, not lawyers, not people with the resources of Charlotte Webb or the institutional backing of Darius Cole. 12 Hargrove County residents, black men and women between the ages of 19 and 64, who had experienced wrongful arrests, unlawful detentions, or excessive force at the hands of the Hargrove County Police Department in the past 4 years. People who had filed complaints and had them dismissed. People who had never filed complaints because they didn't think anyone would listen. People who had seen the news coverage of the Cole case because in mid-April it was everywhere, and recognized in it something that had happened to them. Charlotte Webb, with the explicit approval and active encouragement of Darius Cole, absorbed 7 of the 12 additional cases into an amended lawsuit. The other 5 retained separate attorneys. By the time the consolidated lawsuit was filed in federal court in late April, it represented 14 plaintiffs with documented and corroborated claims against the same systemic pattern of misconduct. The city's exposure increased dramatically. Mayor Gordon Finch, who was up for re-election the following November, called a press conference in early May. He read a prepared statement about accountability, reform, and the city's commitment to justice. When a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asked why it had taken the arrest of a federal agent for the city to examine its own police department, Finch paused for a very long time before saying he deeply regretted the gaps in oversight that had allowed the situation to develop. To the reporter's follow-up question, "Were you aware of the pattern of complaint suppression prior to this investigation?" Finch's communications director responded that the mayor would not answer any further questions. Gordon Finch lost his bid for re-election in November by 11 points. His opponent ran on a one-issue platform, police accountability. He won every precinct in the city except one. The settlement negotiations concluded on June 28th. Hargrove County agreed to pay $10.2 million, distributed as follows: $4.4 million to Darius Cole for wrongful arrest, civil rights violations, and documented involvement in Operation Ironclad. $5.8 million to the 7 additional plaintiffs whose cases were consolidated in the amended complaint, and a non-financial settlement package that included mandatory retraining for the entire department. The installation of body camera accountability software that would record any deactivation outside of designated areas, independent oversight of the complaint review process for a minimum of 5 years, and a formal written apology signed by the acting police chief, the city attorney, and the mayor filed with the public record. Charlotte Webb read the apology at a press conference on July 1st. She read it slowly, each word, into a bank of microphones with Darius Cole at her side. He was silent throughout the press conference. Several reporters later commented on his stillness, the lack of any visible triumph. A journalist writing for The Atlantic described him as a man who had won a war and was still calculating the cost. Operation Ironclad in its original form was over. The 14 months of surveillance, the 3 months undercover, the relationship with Troy BGS, it was all gone, burned away in 6 hours in a holding cell. The FBI reconstructed the operation from a different angle, and while the Bureau's official position was that the new approach was viable, Darius knew, Okafor knew, and Lisa Trenton knew that the version of the case they ultimately took to trial was materially diminished from what it could have been. Troy BGS was eventually arrested, but on lesser charges. He pleaded guilty to a single count of distribution and received a sentence that, in Darius's estimate, was roughly a third of what a fully executed Operation Ironclad would have delivered. That was the cost that never appeared in the settlement. The cost measured not in money, but in criminals who got off scot-free because 2 officers turned off their cameras on a Tuesday night. What happened to Brad Kowalski in the months and years that followed is the part of this story that people who believe in karma recount with particular, quiet satisfaction. His criminal trial began in September. His defense attorney, a man named Dale Pryor, who specialized in law enforcement cases, argued that the arrest had been a good-faith mistake, that Officer Kowalski hadn't known Darius Cole was a federal agent, and that the subsequent discrepancies in the evidence room were the result of clerical confusion rather than theft. The jury disagreed. The Southern Refrigeration recordings, played twice for the jury, made "never mind" the 2 most important words in the courtroom. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Kevin Stowe, who had spent weeks preparing the case with a thoroughness that reflected the full weight of the FBI's institutional support behind him, argued that those 2 words, uttered after Kowalski had visually confirmed the credentials, eliminated any possibility of a good-faith error. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. Brad Kowalski was convicted on 3 counts: violation of civil rights under the color of the law, tampering with evidence, and theft of government property. He was sentenced to 4 years and 7 months in federal prison. Ryan Tess pleaded guilty to obstruction, received an 18-month sentence, and served 14. Pete Dunor, whose cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges had already burned all his bridges in law enforcement, was convicted of conspiracy and corruption charges. At 62, he turned himself into a federal correctional facility in October. His retirement pension, which he had spent 2 years carefully protecting by suppressing complaints, was forfeited. Rick Harlan's case moved more slowly. Contract fraud was complicated, the evidence circumstantial in some places, but Patricia Walden's office was patient, and patient is a word that means something specific when the U.S. Attorney's Office uses it. Harlan ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, a conflict of interest charge, paid a $28,000 fine, and was barred from public employment in the state of Georgia for 10 years. Wayne Stetler, living off his wife's income and a reduced Social Security projection, gave an interview to a local newspaper after his resignation, in which he said that with the benefit of hindsight, he could see that standards had slipped. The interview was widely shared online, largely by people who found the phrase "standards had slipped" an inadequate account of a decade of documented racial bias in his department. He did not give another interview. The offer arrived one Wednesday morning in early August, delivered not through official channels, but over coffee in the kind of quiet corner of an Atlanta restaurant that people choose specifically because it's unlikely to be remembered. The administrator who made the offer, a decent man, Darius thought, a man with genuinely good intentions and a genuine belief that what he was suggesting was a kind gesture, slid a folder across the table and described, in careful, measured language, a senior advisor position within the FBI's training division. Based in Washington, prestigious, the kind of position that from the outside looked like a promotion, the kind of position that from the inside was a windowless room. It was the office's way of protecting one of its own, protecting him by placing him somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. Somewhere the next Brad Kowalski couldn't find him in a parking lot at midnight. Darius listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. He sipped his coffee. He glanced at the folder but didn't open it. Then he thanked the man in front of him, slid the folder back, and said without drama or hesitation, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm going back to the field." The manager looked at him for a long moment. "Darius," he said again, "I'm going back to the field." And that was the end of that conversation. What Darius did with the money is the part of the story that people close to him will tell you matters more than anything else. More than the settlement figure, more than the layoffs, more than the recordings from the Southern surveillance cameras that turned 2 words into federal evidence. He was left with just enough to buy a house, a modest one, in a quiet neighborhood in southwest Atlanta, with a backyard that overlooked a grove of Georgia pines and a front porch on which he'd always told himself he'd eventually take the time to sit. He bought it mortgage-free because he'd spent 11 years living in rented apartments, motels, and under assumed identities. And he wanted, for the first time in his adult life, something that was simply and permanently his. The remainder, $3.1 million, he gave away, not to charity in the abstract, distant sense of a check written to an institution. He gave it to something specific, something built, something that would work, fight, and continue to exist after the news cycle moved on. Working alongside Charlotte Webb, who donated a significant portion of her own case fee, a decision that surprised everyone except those who knew her well, Darius established the Hargrove Fund. The name was deliberate and debated. More than one person in Darius's circle suggested naming it something aspirational, something forward-looking, something that didn't carry the weight of a county that had put him in a cell. Darius disagreed. He wanted the name to do something. He wanted everyone who met him to ask what Hargrove was and then have to sit with the answer. "Shame unnamed changes nothing," he told Charlotte as they were finalizing the paperwork. "If this fund does its job, Hargrove County will spend the next 50 years being known for 2 things, what it did and what it cost them. Both of those things need to live on in the name. Charlotte agreed. She also pointed out, with the practical clarity that made her extraordinary in her work, that a fund named for a county's failure and attached to a $10 million settlement verdict would have no trouble generating press coverage for its cases. She was right. She usually was. The Hargrove Fund's mission statement was precise: legal representation for low-income Georgia residents who had experienced police misconduct, with a particular focus on cases where the internal grievance process had been used not to address wrongdoing but to bury it. The focus on grievance suppression was intentional. It was the thing, more than bad arrests, more than individual officers, that Darius had decided was the real disease. Individual misconduct was a symptom. The machinery that rendered it invisible was the disease. In its first 18 months, the fund took on 23 cases. It won 16 of them, recovering a total of $2.4 million in additional settlements for Georgia residents who had been filing complaints in vain for years. 3 of those cases involved the same county, not Hargrove, but a different one, where a nearly identical pattern of complaint suppression had been operating unseen until the fund's investigators began reviewing the records. The other 7 cases were still active when the fund's first annual report was published. Charlotte Webb's note in the foreword to that report read, in part, "We didn't take the other 7 cases because we thought we'd win them easily. We took them because they were right." The Hargrove Fund doesn't select cases based on the likelihood of winning. It selects them based on whether someone's rights were violated and whether they deserve someone to stand by them when they speak out. Sandra Polk joined the fund's advisory board 6 weeks after the settlement was announced. Her contribution was not merely ceremonial. She brought a methodology for analyzing complaint patterns, which she had honed over 8 years of research at the GPSTC, a methodology that became the fund's primary research framework for identifying systemic misconduct before cases reached court. The board met quarterly, but Sandra and Darius spoke more frequently. They had developed, as often happens between people who have approached the same problem from different perspectives, an unusual mutual respect. "Do you ever regret going back to the field?" she asked him once on the phone during one of their informal conversations. "Every time I'm in a parking lot after midnight," he replied, "and then again the next morning." No. Karan Bledsoe's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 8 months after the agreement, almost exactly a year after the night in question. It was handwritten on plain paper, 4 pages long, and had been rewritten several times, judging by the faint erasing marks visible on certain lines. It was the letter of someone who had been trying to say something for a long time and had finally decided that the discomfort of saying it was less than the burden of remaining silent. Bledsoe wrote that she thought about March 14th every day. She wrote that she replayed the conversation in the corridor, the one that took place at 2:40 a.m. by the cell door, and went over every version of what she could have done differently. She could have made the call herself right there in the corridor instead of taking the message to Denor. She could have pressed the issue more when Denor dismissed it. She could have formally documented the request instead of relying on a verbal exchange that left her with her word against the sergeants. She wrote that she understood why she hadn't done those things. The weight of the hierarchy, the first year on the job, the particular paralysis of being new enough to doubt yourself in every situation, but understanding why she hadn't made it easier to live with. She wrote that she hoped the small thing she had tried to do in that hallway had meant something. Darius read the letter twice. Then he sat down at the kitchen table in his house in southwest Atlanta one Tuesday morning, the Georgia sun streaming through the window, and wrote her a 3-page handwritten reply. He told her that what she had done in that hallway was no small thing. He told her that in every complex situation he'd been professionally involved in, and there had been many over 11 years of federal work, the determining moral variable was never the person with the most power or the clearest authority. It was always the person with the least of both who chose, in a moment of difficulty, to act as if doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. He told her that Denor had the authority, the seniority, and the institutional protection to do the right thing that night and had chosen not to. She had almost none of that and had chosen differently. That difference was not small. That difference, in his view, was the very definition of character. He told her about the Horror Fund. He told her about the 23 cases. He told her that each of those cases had begun with someone deciding, against the weight of habit, hierarchy, and the path of least resistance, that someone's rights were worth defending. He told her that the night of March 14th had cost him something real and significant, 14 months of operational work, a case that should have sent a man to prison for a decade, but instead delivered a fraction of that time. A particular kind of trust in the ordinary security of ordinary situations, the kind of trust that, once broken, takes longer to rebuild than any agreement can measure. And then he told her that it had also given him something, not in spite of what had happened, not as a glimmer of hope, something he found a fundamentally dishonest framework, but as a consequence of what he chose to do afterward. The fund, the cases, the 23 people who had had someone by their side in a process they would have faced alone without the fund. None of that existed without March 14th. He wasn't grateful for that night. He would never be grateful for that night. But he had a clear vision of what it had produced, and having a clear vision of what suffering produces without sanitizing the suffering, without pretending the cost was worth it, was, he had come to believe, the closest thing to wisdom he had ever attained. He signed the letter as he signed everything professional. Special Agent Darius Cole, FBI Atlanta Field Office. Then, underneath, he added a line he had never written in anything professional in his career. Thanks for 2:40 a.m. It meant more than you know. What Darius Cole's story really teaches us is that injustice rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with villain music or obvious malice written all over its face. It arrives as habit, as complacency, like a sergeant eating a sandwich while a man in cell 4 asks for a phone call for the third time. It arrives in checked boxes, turned off cameras, and complaints quietly filed away and buried with the same discretion. The story of Harrow County isn't unique, and that's precisely why it matters. Somewhere right now, in some county department somewhere across this country, a clock is ticking. The question is whether the Karen Bledsoes in those departments will stop it before the FBI arrives, or whether the city will learn the price of complacency with a $10 million bill. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, if it made you think about accountability, about who is protecting the people the laws are meant to protect, then do something with that feeling. Like this video so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story the world needs you to know. These stories exist, whether we tell them or not, but when we tell them out loud, together, without looking away, something changes. Let's keep that going.